Chapter 2, and there were many fewer. At first glance, it appears that the modern nations of the European landmass are engaged in a process that ends up with demographic auctioneer saying, quote, going, gone, end quote. It's not that bad, but still astonishing, and by my lights, disheartening. I hear American and commentators, particularly of the conservative bent, say, quote, European is a decadent place. Europeans have never recovered from their loss of empire. Europe's leaders and intellectuals are so snotty to America and the American way of life because they are jealous and increasingly irrelevant. End quote. I can only add that if that few were correct, the astonishingly low European fertility numbers would tend to prove the position. We are literally hearing the same thing, the whole decadence decay thing. And the World Earth, it talks about like things that could be affecting the fertility rate, which is homosexual and LGBT community is the decadence decay that the conservatives currently are talking about. So, very fascinating how reoccurring this is. Okay. In the aggregate, the European nations are known officially in UN demographic data as part of the developed regions. At one time, most of these nations were often called the First World, the distinction to the poor nation of the Third World, while the command economy nations of the Soviet bloc were sometimes characterized as the Second World. In the UN Population Division documents, the distinction initially was, quote, more developed countries and less developed countries. Apparently, these classifications were seen as somewhat demeaning. How could the United Nations, of all organizations, possibly declare that one nation be less than the other nation? Or more? And so the UN classifiers went to work. Today, officials there are only the unwieldy terms developed nations and developing nations. I expect the next change will be to Group A and Group B, with Group B labeling the rich countries. I use here the clearing previous terminology. More developed countries and less developed countries. Other loose synonyms for the developed nations include modern nations or the West or Western civilizations. At various times in this book, these terms appear almost interchangeably. Qualifications for the club include relative influence, democratic governance in many forms, and general modernity. In this grouping are all the European nations, including Russia all the way to Siberia, including the nations of Ukraine and Belarus, the North American nations of the United States and Canada, and the Pacific nations of Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The major plausible exceptions in this group is Russia, which is not nearly as modern, affluent, or democratic as the others, and certainly not as healthy. But Russia appears to be moving in the right direction, though the deadlines seem to change day to day. The inclusion of Japan is noteworthy. We often say West, but what we hear or think is white. I guess that's kind of true. We do associate West with white. Anyways, Japan is not white, for that matter. It is of the West in any geopolitical sense. But for almost 60 years, it has been a modern, well-to-do, and democratic nation. That puts it in the club, and the UN counts it that way. Thus, most white nations are developed, but all developed nations are not white. About modernity, then, think economics, not biology. Think class, not race. Yeah, I don't know about that, since it's like the class is associated with the caste system of race and who falls into what solidified stereotype. So it is kind of avoiding the issue by being colorblind. Alright. The antecedents of the new demography among the modern nations are most interesting. In the early 1950s, the decade following the end of World War II, women in the developed nations typically born 7 children over the course of their fertility years. That 2.7 was a high level for modern nations in the mid-20th century, but there were quite clear reasons for at least a part of the elevated rate. In the 1930s, the world had experienced the deepest, longest, and most widespread economic depression ever recorded. It was immediately followed by World War II, which, unlike World War I, encompassed most of the planet. Today, the Depression and World War II caused many couples to delay their childbearing plans, even to alter their childbearing fertility ability. The Depression made it difficult to provide the wherewithal to raise and support children. The war took many potential fathers out of contact with women, and vice versa. By the mid-1940s, both the war and depression had ended, spirits rebounded, and so did fertility. Couples, quote, making up for lost time, end quote, contributed mightily to the so-called baby boom throughout the developed world. In the 1950s, the United States, where the boom was particularly potent and extended, the fertility rate soared as high as 3.8 children per woman. That rate is far above what today would be described as third world fertility. New American suburbs were nicknamed fertile acres. America was in heat. The baby boom was surely an important story, and one whose results we're still living with, but it bears repeating that at least part of it came about due to extraneous reasons. Depression and war. 25 years after the end of the World War II, the 1970s to 1975 timeframe, the 1950 TFR of 2.8 children per woman for all the modern nations had already receded to 2.1. There was 24% decline down to just the rate of which a population remained stable over time. All seemed in demographic order in the modern world in the early 1970s. The demographic magic number of 2.1 had been reached. Surely that 2.1 rate or thereabouts is what most demographers had assumed would happen. Most long-term demographic projections, including most cited of the UN projection, had showed fertility leveling off at 2.1 for both more developed and less developed countries, albeit at very different moments in history. Over the long terms, after all, how could it be otherwise? If the TFR dipped substantially below replacement levels and stayed there, humankind would eventually disappear, proceeding to zero at a steep geometric rate of decline. If it remains above replacement and stayed there, we would experience a real population explosion, expanding geometrically. The resultant pile of newly born human flesh expanding at the speed of light, which is how one explosionist described the situation to a congressional committee. The standard graph was elegant, sloping gracefully to the mystical level of 2.1, where it stayed apparently forever. One could sense the presence of design in the equation of humanity, perhaps even a divine design. This elegant formula was a part of what experts called demographic transition, which had been in motion for several hundred years in the modern world. Briefly put, transition theory explains how a population moves from high fertility and high mortality into low fertility and low mortality. It may sound more complicated than it is. Consider a simple version of transition theory. In the old days, before modern medicine and modern sanitation, couples bore many children. Many of those children died before their own time of reproduction. In 1790, when the first U.S. census was taken, the total fertility rate was almost 8 children per woman, believed to be among the highest in the world at the time. Benjamin Franklin wrote how children swarmed across the countryside like, quote, a wave of locusts, end quote. But infant and child mortality was also high. I walked through an old church cemetery one day and looked at some of the tiny headstones. High fertility, high mortality. If many babies died, parents would have to conceive and bear many children in order to leave heirs and get help tilling the land. There was logic to that. With changing medical conditions and improving public sanitation, infant mortality plunged. In 1900s in the United States, 165 of every 1,000 infants died before reaching their first birthday. Today, the rate is 7.0. In Japan, the infant mortality rate was 51 in early 1950s and 3 today. So, as transition theory has it, couples needed to conceive fewer children to replace themselves, and accordingly had fewer children. Low infant mortality yielded low fertility, with very few temporary exceptions. High to low was the general trend in developing nations, with the low scheduled to settle in at about 2.1 per children for women. But that's not what happened. Today, with the exception of just the minuscule Albania, every modern nation, 44 of them, is below that 2.1 replacement level. Almost all of them well below it. The only serious outlier is America, which according to National Center for Health Statistics recorded 2.01 in the year 2002, just a bit below the replacement level. Albania, total population 3.1 million, roughly the population of metropolitan Cleveland, isn't a very modern place anyway. Albania fertility rate, now officially at 2.3, has fallen from 6.0 in the late 1950s and is probably now below replacement level. What happened to the equilibrated harmony of the transition theory? It ran into one problem. While most families with demographers in them have children, most children are not born to families with demographers in them. Young people make individuals and private decisions about family size, often in the privacy of their bedrooms. They are not concerned with distant population projections. They do not worry about the replacement rate. They do not care if the graceful curved line on the graph settles at 2.1 or below or above. For now, they don't seem to care about whether their own nations will grow or shrink rapidly. In political science and sociology, such mass personal behavior is often colorfully described as, quote, people voting with their feet, end quote. In other words, people move from farm to city or from Mexico to America based on individual personal decisions. But in the realm of demography, that is only partially so. There has been less sex, there has not been less sex, just less procreation. That makes sense. Acting without permission of the demographers, the peoples of European and Japan and some American subgroups began having fewer and fewer children. Individually, case by case, they created a collective revolution of falling propagation. In the late 1950s, the European TFR was 2.7. In the early 1970s, the rate was 2.16. Then from 1985 to 1990, the number of children per woman in the developing world fell to 1.8 children per woman. Now, the world had seen low fertility rates before, even below replacement level fertility rates, but such rates had occurred in times of plagues, war, economic depression, famine, or great social disruption. Afterward, fertility rebounded, but unequally in the modern nations during the 1980s. This was happening without catastrophic factors. In a time of peace for these nations, albeit in the context of a generally in the general Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, fertility dropped even faster. The modern economies were largely prosperous, in fact, reaching a point of prosperity unmatched in human history, certainly so in the non-communist part of Europe. Yet the 1.8 TFR was the lowest non-catastrophic such numbers ever recorded.